Good morning. My name is Christy Wooten, and I'm president of the Atlanta Press Club. Thank you all for joining us today for our online Newsmaker event, a conversation with U.S. Attorney BJay Pak. Online events such as these allow us to engage experts and top journalists in discussions about topics that impact the health and livelihood of journalists and people from all walks of life. I would like to remind you today that if you have questions for our speaker or moderator, please type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you have any notes for the panelists, you may also use the chat function to do that. Thank you again for supporting the work of the Atlanta Press Club by joining this webinar with us today. Please visit atlantapressclub.org for our upcoming events, to sponsor an event, to join as a member, or to donate to the club. As we begin, we would like to extend a special welcome and thank you to our title sponsor, Wellstar Healthcare System. Wellstar is the sponsor of the entire Newsmaker series, and we are grateful for their support. Today's presenting sponsor is Communities in Schools of Georgia. Thank you for your sponsorship. We'd also like to thank Baker Hostetler and the First Amendment Foundation of Georgia for their program sponsorships of today's event. Today, we've asked Ken Foskett, Senior Editor of Investigations at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, to lead the discussion. Ken covered legal affairs and state politics before serving as the AJC's Washington correspondent from 1996 to 2001. Prior to joining the Journal-Constitution in 1989, Foskett worked for 3 years in Southern Africa for Save the Children. He is a graduate of Yale and the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and the author of the 2004 biography of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas called Judging Thomas. He is also a member of the Atlanta Press Club's Board of Directors. Please welcome Ken, who will introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, Christy. It's great to be here. Today, we're pleased to have BJay Pak, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. President Trump appointed Attorney Pak to his post in late 2017. Before that, Attorney Pak served in the Georgia House of Representatives from 2011 to 2017. He is the first Korean American to serve in the Georgia legislature and the first Asian American to serve as U.S. Attorney in Georgia. He'll begin with an overview of his caseload, and then we'll move to a moderated discussion. We welcome your questions in the chat function of the Zoom window. Please welcome U.S. Attorney Pak.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you for that introduction. And I am very honored to be here addressing all of you, particularly this audience. Although it may not be the largest group of folks that I've had the honor of addressing, but I could certainly say that you are one of the most important, because the role of the media is very fundamental and important to a free society. And being a first-generation Korean American, and living through the 1980s, where President John Dillon took over after a coup, the first thing that he did was to suppress the press. And so coming over to the United States and seeing how free we are, I do bring a different perspective about law and order and the role of government. It's been almost 3 years since I took the helm of the United States Attorney's Office here, and by virtue of my appointment, I am the Chief Federal Law Enforcement in this district. As an institution, our office has been very blessed with terrific leadership over the years, and a steady and constant dedication of consummate professionals who dedicated themselves to the rule of law. And as a result, I am a benefactor of that great leadership. And so when I took over the helm of the office, my goal was pretty simple. I wanted to, whenever my tenure is done here, I wanted to leave the office a little bit better than it was previously. Those of you who may not be aware, I was an assistant United States attorney in this office from the early 2000s to the late 2000s, and working in the criminal division. So I understand the institutional significance that this office has played over the history of our district and our state. And I come to work every day in awe that a little boy who immigrated to the United States, not being able to speak one word of English, is now the Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer in this district. And I say to myself, only in America can that happen. The office has grown over the years. The office now boasts close to 110 lawyers and 130 professionals. So I run a medium-sized law firm by today's standards, but a important and a quite powerful one. One of the things I would like to point out is that in between my tenure as an assistant U.S. attorney and now the U.S. attorney, the world has changed significantly, particularly because of technology. As a result, the way we do our business and the caseload that we have has changed significantly from the time when I was in the office. At the same time, it raised some significant challenges, and also the crime, however, the fundamental nature of crime that we investigate is taking a different medium. One of the priorities that our office takes on, number one priority, is to fight terrorism. As a result, our office participated in the Joint Terrorism Task Force here. I think we're well aware of that. But the mission of the JTTF has changed slightly with the rise of extremist groups and acts of domestic terrorism that has surfaced in recent years. We pay a lot of attention and spend out a lot of time that things that you may not see in the news on an everyday basis in the intelligence and disruption business. I could tell you that even in our district, we have certain extremist groups operating, and the intel has told us, and I think some of the news reporters have reported, that under the recent events of peaceful protests and hiding under that cover, some of these extremist groups have been active. Of course, the first priority we took on as a department when we came on was to protect against violent crime and also to make our community safer. And the department relaunched Project Safe Neighborhoods, we call it version 2.0, to redouble our efforts, and at the time, as a priority of the Attorney General Jeff Sessions, to reverse the slight trend of increase in violent crime that we were suffering at the time. As a result, the focus was to collaborate with our state and local partners in supporting them in how the federal government could play a role in supporting them to fight the violent crime that may be occurring in their area. One of the things that we're doing is we have monthly meetings with state and local partners, prosecutors, and also law enforcement agencies, along with the federal agencies, to discuss cases and sometimes refer cases of individuals who may be driving a violent crime in the area. We look at it and we decide whether or not which government, if they were to investigate and prosecute, would get the best result in making communities safe. We do that every week, every month, and we also have a focus on an area. So not just individual focus and particular individuals, but also an area. We look at the area to determine what type of investment and also what type of law enforcement and community investments needed in that area. And we bring everybody together, including community groups, religious groups, other nonprofits, law enforcement, government officials, and of course, state and local prosecutors, to see how we could address the area to decrease violent crimes that occur. So that's a place-based kind of methodology. The other part of that, which I don't think gets much news, is the reducing of the recidivism rate of folks who are coming out of the prison system. We have adopted a credible messenger program here, which has shown early promise in other jurisdictions in reducing chances of recidivism by people returning into community after being institutionalized in prisons. What we discovered is that there's multiple barriers for folks to re-enter society as productive citizens. In order to help guide and facilitate them transitioning into productive life, we found out that folks who have actually walked the walk or been through the similar instances and have completely transitioned into a productive life, serving as mentors works the best instead of just law enforcement or probation officer playing that role, although they do have a role. What we did is we invested our own money along with the grants and brought together various credible messengers, provided some training, and also we worked very closely with Georgia Department of Corrections in making sure that folks who are transitioning out, and these individuals that we selected have violent criminal convictions and were associated gang members. We try to surround them with services and mentor opportunities before they get out, 6 months prior to that. We launched this program with the Atlanta Metro Reentry Center, and 3 months is getting to network and understanding the underlying issues. And then the last 3 months, we focus on reuniting them with family members. And that's really, really key. And even when they come out of the prison system, they continue these relationships, these positive relationships that keep them from falling back into the exact same situation that they got them in trouble in the first place. I am very happy to note that although this is early, our investment, I think, has shown some very optimistic results. First, we've had a couple cohorts of students in the Metro Reentry Center, and we had 66 folks who had violent criminal convictions, who are, many of them are verified gang members. And they work with our credible messenger partners into this program, 6-month program. We were successful after 25 of them have been released from the prison. So far, we had 92% success in family reunification in this population. 84% have not recidivated into the lifestyle. And even those folks who did, in fact, get arrested, none were for violent crime. What's more important is that 70% of those, 72% of those individuals who went through the program and who were part of the Credible Messenger Initiative, 72% is gainfully employed. And what's key, what we found out is that incorporating family members, because sometimes we forget that the family members are going through some issues as well. If you have someone who's just coming out without any support, they struggle as well. Incorporating them into the before they transition out into the counseling sessions and providing that continuous support and creating that support system. Even when they get out, the credible messengers put them into a support group through our partnership with Offender Alumni Group. They meet regularly to talk about issues, just to touch base. Our credible messengers are incredible and dedicated. They continue to check up on every single one to keep them on the right path. The goal, of course, is to reduce recidivism after 3 years. As a result, what it requires is a long-term investment, not just 1 or 2 years. So we're in the second year of the program, and I'm very cautiously optimistic that this might produce some very, very good results in reducing this revolving door that we see on an everyday basis. A couple other large initiatives that you may be aware of: opioid crisis. Because of the coronavirus and the killing of George Floyd and the protests that are going on, I think we kind of lost sight of the fact that we had this big surge in opioid-related deaths. I'm happy to note that we have launched an initiative in our office called SCOPE, which was to strategically combat the opioid epidemic through some prosecution, education, and enforcement. Not only did we prosecute some pill mill doctors, and that's a no-brainer, we also looked at kind of the transition to heroin and the heroin supply. And we doubled up our enforcement efforts into taking down the heroin. One of the things that we did, because we noticed that the state had trouble prosecuting individuals who sell fentanyl laced or heroin that's laced with fentanyl that's causing overdose deaths, that they couldn't charge them with a traditional murder or felony murder because of the causation requirement. That's where we could kind of help step in to fill that gap. Under the federal law, if you just cause a serious bodily injury because of some drug, including fentanyl, that you can actually get a pretty high sentence, including a mandatory minimum. So we use that hammer to kind of deter people from dealing items that they obtain from unknown sources, particularly in the dark web. In addition, of course, we also looked at kind of prescriber habits, using prescription data that we identify some of those prescribers who are outliers versus their peers. And we did a very stringent kind of filtering mechanism to see what the data cannot explain in terms of normal practices. And we sent letters, approximately 3 dozen letters to the providers to let them know that the data is showing something out of the ordinary. They're not being investigated, but we just wanted to alert them that. And we got report back of several of the institutions that have done sub-audits to that to find out that sometimes the prescription pad was a little bit looser than the way they like to be. In addition to the public awareness of this epidemic and also the readily available Narcan supply in our community, our opioid overdose deaths have significantly decreased since 2 years ago. The latest data that I saw from April for the state of Georgia, we have a reduction over 50% in overdose deaths. So I think we are making progress in that regard, and certainly I think that some of our efforts had a part in trying to tackle that problem. The other big issues I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions on is elder fraud. Our older American generation has been targeted for specific financial fraud, and the use of technology by individuals who are overseas has made committing fraud much easier. This is a multi-billion-dollar problem every single year. The Attorney General, William Barr, in 2019 launched a transnational task force to tackle this problem, to go after the large organizations that are targeting the elderly, and created 6 strike forces around the country. We were lucky enough to get one of the 6. We have a strike force, elder fraud strike force here. We've had significant success in tackling large organization elder fraud. And you'll see continuing reports coming out of our office as we bring these folks justice. One other thing that I would like to point out is everybody's annoyed by these spam calls on their cell phones and their telephone lines. The department, along with our office, is looking to shut down those enablers of those spam calls that result in the fraud. One particular type of fraud that I think people should be aware is quite interesting is this romance scheme that's kind of prevalent. A lot of these frauds originate from the Western Africa area, Nigeria. The basic scam is that they pretend to be a potential paramour. They talk for a long time and then gain their trust. And they usually request money because they can't come back to America without finishing a project or whatnot. And a lot of our victims fall prey to this fraud. So be on the lookout for that. And we did a lot of outreach, including a large town hall with the Secretary of State's office and ARP to tackle this issue. Cybercrime, of course, is the computers and the internet has changed the way things are crimes are investigated and committed. One of the big things that we've done here recently that your crowd would certainly would realize is that we brought charges against 4 Chinese military hackers who we accused of them being responsible for hacking the Equifax company here and stealing over 300 million Americans' personal identifying information. It's a part of a troubling trend by a nation-sponsored hacking. Not only did they steal financial information, but those of you who are following this news very closely, the Chinese government, not the Chinese people, the Chinese government was responsible for hacking into, as the government alleged, Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and of course, OPM government. It's interesting to see what the government is doing with all that information, because they're not being sold for profit in the dark net. So our corporate citizens must be vigilant in making sure that our cybersecurity and companies are working closely with law enforcement to protect all of us and protect our private information from further exploitation. And of course, the last thing that we focused on, the last thing that I want to bring up that we focused on and get garnering a lot of press is public corruption. This is one of those areas that I think that the Department of Justice could provide a lending hand. Unfortunately, public corruption is in nature, it seems to be, it comes in cycles. And unfortunately, it never ends from our perspective. We do get lots of tips and we're required to follow up. I'm sure everybody's familiar with our years-long investigation into corruption in City Hall and prior administration. So far, we've secured 7 guilty pleas. We've indicted 2 others, and our investigation is continuing. But not only are we looking at elected officials, we also look at folks who are in government who are exploiting their positions for either for profit or other type of exploitation. We've had a history of looking at folks who are in federal and state government use their positions to extort a bribe from a certain vendor or people who are dealing with the government, and also abusing public trust by overspending their money, P cards, things like that. You may wonder, I mean, do we need to make a federal case out of that? And I say to you, yes, we do make a determination whether or not this case is worthy of a federal prosecution. But absence of other investigation and prosecution, by not doing anything about it, even if it's a relatively small dollar amount, $10,000 to $20,000, if not doing anything, we're condoning that behavior, which erodes the trust that people and citizens place in government. So we believe it's very important. The Department of Justice plays a very important role in enforcing those type of laws. To summarize, I've been very fortunate to inherit an office filled with such consummate professionals. Our mission always stays the same, and it's to seek justice. Regardless of whether or not we see administration change and resource allocation and priority change, the Department of Justice, particularly our office, the United States Attorney's Office, is committed to the rule of law. And I am very honored to lead this office, even through very tumultuous times. That did not foresee that I would be leading the office through a government shutdown and various other pandemics that we've seen. But I am very honored to stand with my AUSAs and our professionals in our office, also with our law enforcement and the media, to make sure that we protect the fundamental institutions that are so dear to all of us, which combined together, it preserves the freedoms that we enjoy every single day. And as a first-generation immigrant, I have a deeper and truly deep understanding and appreciation for that. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Yeah, great. Attorney Pak, thank you very much. I'd like to follow up on something you mentioned in your remarks. What can you tell us about the nature of extremist groups that your office investigates, is aware of? And in talking to your colleagues around the country, how active are they in Georgia compared to other places?
Well, one of the things that we do is the Joint Terrorism Task Force, particularly the FBI and the Domestic Terrorism Group, follow these groups very, very closely. And Northern District Georgia is not exempt from these groups. They exist in our community. And I think this has been reported, and I could talk about it, as you know, that our great partner up in Floyd County District Attorney, Lee Patterson, is prosecuting 3 members of a group called The Base that the Department of Justice and the domestic terrorism experts are following a long time. We coordinate with our colleagues from all around the country, obviously, and internationally as well. This is a top priority, but Northern Georgia, although we've seen the presence and also some activity with respect to these extremist groups, we're fortunate that we have not had an attack, an organized attack, or anything of real significance that threatened the livelihood of folks in our district. So compared to the other district, we're not in the most high-risk category, but we are very we are on the radar in terms of it's a district that provides all kinds of resources and diversity, and also if you look at kind of our commerce and our roadways, it's a perfect place to kind of set up at the same time to communicate with their counterparts. Now, the internet and the darknet and encryption has made tracking these groups much more difficult, but rest assured that the law enforcement agents are tracking them very closely, and we have lots of resources to make sure that we disrupt or they are able to carry out some of the planned attacks that they may be contemplating.
Great, thank you. Can you tell us, is the Northern District investigating any cases of, quote, unlawful behavior stemming from protests in Georgia?
The FBI and the law enforcement, we're in the support role from the APD and all the local law enforcement who are making sure that the protests are staying safe. We are definitely looking at incidences of folks who have caused damage, particularly with fire, with different types of property damage or against police cars and police officers, and to see if some of these individuals travel interstate to actually incite a riot, which is against the federal law. Now, that being said, we're not interested in, nor are we doing anything about folks who are peacefully protesting or even breaking curfew. That's not what we're here for. We're only looking at instances where people are coming for the purpose of inciting a riot, causing damage, endangering lives of people who are peacefully protesting. And I think a lot of reporting has been going on. We've been working very closely with the local law enforcement, particularly Chief Shields in Atlanta, to provide any support that we can. We are actually looking at cases where individuals have, in fact, used the cover of peaceful protest to carry out nefarious deeds, such as causing damage, throwing Molotov cocktails, or otherwise assaulting peace officers.
If you could put a number on those cases, would it be less than 10, less than 25, less than 50? Just approximately, what is the scope of these cases?
I would say less than a dozen right now. But
Right.
as the police reports come in and intelligence come in, we do additional investigation to see if we want to have evidence before we do charge anybody else. Certainly, we do that. We do a thorough job. But I could tell you that there's less than a dozen right now. But there's additional matters that are open that we're looking into.
Right. Last week, Attorney General William Barr said that it is, quote, undeniable that many African Americans lack confidence in our American criminal justice system, adding, quote, this must change. How must that system change in your view?
I think when I left the legislature and a policy role, even before then, because of my background, I had an understanding how communities interact with police. One of the things that we have to be careful of is, as tragic as that incident was when we're suffocating Mr. Floyd in Minneapolis, that we don't think that we attribute that type of conduct to every single police department. We have over 200 law enforcement agencies in the Northern District. One thing I could tell you that is the standards and the practices that the peace officers in Georgia employ, they will never allow, nor is it within permissible conduct, to do what's been depicted in the video against Mr. Floyd. One of the things I think we need to start with is have a real good conversation about why that distrust began. Also look for reforms, because everybody, including law enforcement, is interested in making sure that they are better. They earn the trust to protect individuals and communities, and all ideas should be on the table. And one of the best ways that we could do that is to make sure that we guarantee due process for everyone who's accused, and also do promptly and swiftly when the evidence is there to bring charge. The incidences in Minneapolis and also in Brunswick, I think, demonstrate, regardless of what caused the delay, that delay in justice is, justice delayed may be justice denied. I'm glad that charges are going forward on that, but certainly our system of criminal justice, while not perfect, is pretty good. But at the same time, we have to commit ourselves to making it better.
I'm curious, as an Asian American, whether you ever experienced either negative interactions with the justice system or police or in your family, or just how that was for you growing up in this country.
I think as an Asian American, my experience is not as bad as our Black American friends or colleagues. The fact of the matter is, I think that to the extent that there is bias against Asian Americans, it's certainly not to the degree that we see in either Latino or Black Americans. So I personally have not had negative incidences with law enforcement, but I do know people who have. I do think that there is, because law enforcement agents and law enforcement officers are human, we are subject to the frailties of humanity. But the fact of the matter is, we have to take this opportunity, like we did, um, you know, this opportunity to make sure that that we commit ourselves to being better. Unfortunately, these incidents occur too often, and one of the most vivid memories, being Asian American, the way I was impacted was after the Rodney King verdict came out in 1992, and there were LA riots. Um, there were lots of looting going on by some of the folks who were not peacefully protesting, and the, the largest population that suffered the most economic damage was Asian American businesses in those areas. That kind of spurned a lot of folks of Asian American descent uh, to enter public service, and you saw that LAPD at the time got a surge in Asian American police officers because at that time they had zero voice. And it was I was a senior in high school when that occurred, and that was one of the incidences that prompted me to look at public service as a career because it's very important that people who are making decisions that have real human consequences bring different perspectives, diverse perspectives, and being an Asian American in this role, I feel like I do have a platform and a way to contribute to making society better and to avoid those type of issues in the future.
CNN reports that DOJ investigations into unconstitutional policing practices have all but disappeared under the current administration. Should they be brought back, in your opinion?
I don't think that it has disappeared. I think what you're seeing is a different form. One of the philosophical differences from the previous administration is that we found that the consent decrees are not as effective in bringing about change. So one of the things that I know that the Department of Justice has focused on is, despite that tool is available sometimes to have a consent decree take over the department, it's much better to work with the local law enforcement and with the community to improve the police department. So that doesn't add to the stats, but I could guarantee you that we are involved in all kinds of investigations, particularly pattern and practice investigation in police departments. Not to mention, we're very aggressive, particularly in this district, has been very aggressive in bringing charges against law enforcement officers who use excessive force. Matter of fact, in the last 2 years, we brought 3 cases where there's excessive force in jails. Those cases are always tough, obviously, but at the same time, we're not shying away from that because it's very important that the rule of law be maintained. And police officers, despite their oath and despite their job, aren't exempt from the rule of law. And we will do everything we can to bring them to justice when we see crime that occurs.
The department is considering hate crime charges in the Ahmaud Arbery shooting. What challenges do these cases present for prosecutors?
Well, I think that the preliminary hearing transcript and the testimony of the GBI agent was the first glimpse into some evidence with racial animus. And so I have full confidence that the district attorney in Cobb County and also the GBI will be able to bring charges, although Georgia does not have a hate crime law right now. But at the same time, I know that my colleague down in the Southern District, Bobby Christine, has been working from day one, only because of comity reasons that we defer to the state to go first in prosecutions. But if the justice is not done in that case, I have no doubt that the Department of Justice will seek to bring charges. The challenge, of course, is to prove that the intent was of committing the crime was motivated by prohibited factors such as race. And the federal government has a hate crime statute, so we will be able to use that.
Very good. Many are predicting long-term damage to businesses and institutions because of the coronavirus. How has the pandemic impacted cases handled by your office?
Well, obviously, public health and safety comes number one. One of the things that we've done, along with every institution, including the courts, that we have respected the guidelines by the public health officials. We have gone through maximum telework, but our law enforcement agents have never stopped. When we needed to enforce the law, we were able to make arrests and file criminal charges. One difference was that the courts have suspended the grand jury. And under the Constitution, everybody's accused must be indicted by a grand jury who are accused of a felony. And so that was a little bit delayed. But I'm happy to know, at least in the Northern District, that we have reopened the grand jury starting last week. And matter of fact, as I sit here today, we have another grand jury hearing cases right now. Now, it's really up to the courts and of course the public health officials on when we're going to be able to have trials again. Under the Constitution, unlike some civil cases, we can't do everything by video and Zoom. The Confrontation Clause guarantees accused defendants to see and face the witnesses against them in court. And so we are looking to see what steps we can make to guarantee those constitutional rights and at the same time protect the health of the jurors and properly socially distance. And we're having discussions on every single day about how to do that correctly, because I believe that the public right to know and jury trials is one of the most important rights that we have of guaranteeing due process, and particularly with respect to criminal accusations. So it's a priority number one for us. But beyond that, although we've gone virtually, our work has never stopped, and it's starting to ramp back up because the grand jury are starting to meet again.
Great. All right. Our first question from the audience. On August 14th, 2019, you said that you did not intend to have the investigation of the city of Atlanta, quote, drag on, and that the investigation was definitely moving. The question is, what is the status of the investigation? Can you tell us if or when there will be more indictments? Will former Atlanta Mayor Kasim Reed be included in upcoming indictments?
Well, I can't comment on that last part of that question, but I could tell you that there are activities that are planned in the upcoming months. Now, grand jury restarted again, so I would anticipate that, and during the time that the coronavirus has slowed down the court system in terms of operations, investigations didn't stop. So as we ramp back, we're going to go back to the same timetable. One of the things that we don't want to do is rush into things. Or when we get a credible lead or a tip, I think it's our obligation to try to follow that. Of course, that does stretch our resources a little thin, but we have devoted a significant amount of resources to moving these cases forward. And my intention is not to drag on these investigations because they were open before I got here. But I think the public should know that as soon as we have one defendant, for example, who have pled guilty and agreed to cooperate, and they provide some evidence or testimony, then we have to follow up and make sure that the information is true before we accuse someone. That's part of the reason why the grand jury in the federal system is secret, because we do not want to unnecessarily tarnish someone's reputation when there's no credence to certain tips or give any semblance that there's something inappropriate there. But we are moving with all deliberate speed, and we expect that things to be coming to close pretty soon.
So perhaps the biggest case coming up is the trial of Mitzi Vickers, which I believe is now scheduled in September. What will the testimony reveal about corruption at Atlanta City Hall?
I think if you look at the indictment in this case, the accusations are pretty detailed. On top of that, I think some of the great reporting done by the media have really connected dots. There's some evidence that the court would be presented with and the jury would hear that the media does not know. But I think if you look at the publicly filed documents, that you could have a good glimpse of what the evidence that we intend to show. And then we'll let the jury decide whether or not they believe that Ms. Vickers is guilty of the crime charge.
You know, going back a little bit ways, some of your prosecutors in very brief comments to the media described a quote unquote culture of corruption at City Hall. Can you describe that culture in broad strokes? What did it look like?
I want to make sure that we're not commenting on the current administration. Those comments were made in context of the previous administration.
Right.
I think it's really an inference of all the things that we have discovered during our investigation and we brought to light through court filing. Generally, tone and the culture of an organization is set at the top when you're very strict about compliance and making sure that you set a tone that we're not going to tolerate misbehavior or of guidelines or ethical standards. And that flows all the way down to the folks who are maybe at the lowest level in terms of pay grade and things like that. I think the evidence that's been filed and that we have proven in court has shown that there's a lax in oversight and kind of compliance in the previous administration. That allowed situations where people were allowed to get too close to vendors. The message was sent to the public that perhaps that the way to do business, it was this way. And unfortunately, that results, of course, in the federal government stepping in and looking at that culture, looking at individuals who are responsible for creating that culture and bringing them to justice if the evidence is there to prove that they violated federal law. And we're doing that. And we believe that's a very important mission for us, particularly because sometimes because of the political nature of public corruption cases, that the state and locals have a bigger hurdle to bring an independent charge, an independent look at it. This is where the federal government, I think, will really play a role in making sure and restoring the trust in government that people should have.
Returning to the issue of extremism, Georgia, a question from the audience. Please compare the threat posed by Antifa as compared to white supremacist groups such as the KKK or similar groups.
Well, it's hard to compare because there are many groups that use the name Antifa. There are many groups who are affiliated with white nationalism. There's not a one unifying force. But I will tell you that there are violent tendencies. The intel is telling us that there are violent tendencies on both sides. And one of the things that we were very concerned about in law enforcement was the counter-protest situation where these groups had legitimate cover to come out, someone with guns. We didn't have it in our district, but I could tell you that in my colleagues around the country, another name that you've seen in the press is the Boogaloo Boys. We have some 3%ers out there. Their ideology, their names are different. They may look a little different, but the ideology is kind of the same. They're willing to disrupt law and order, and that's a threat to public safety. We were very lucky in the Northern District, and with the terrific work of the law enforcement agents, we were able to get ahead of that with the intel agencies and also to work with our state and local law enforcement agents to plan for those type of things. And but our district is not as bad as other districts. And our district, I think we were very lucky in that we work very closely together with all agencies, all federal and state and local agencies, that we have a pretty well-oiled machine when it comes to battling those extreme groups.
Another question from the audience that you might have a handle on given your experience in the legislature, but questioner wondering if there is a connection between justice that's rendered in rural counties that have one commissioner systems, which there are many in Georgia, or one elected official in a city.
I wouldn't say there's a direct connection, but I think just common sense tells you that when you have more people making decisions, it's hard to kind of get them to agree to something that's abusive or illegal. So just a general kind of a good practice and compliance is that in things that could be exploited, you want to make sure that the segregation of duties and responsibilities are done. I have not seen a single commissioner counties subject to more reported abuse or corruption than others. But I think the potential is higher because no one's there to kind of overlook or oversee all of that except for the public. And a lot of times the public may feel intimidated by people in power. You know, as long as that we have good checks and balances of a very well-informed electorate, that they could take action politically by voting against them and voting them out, I think we'll be okay. But a lot of times, I think we get in trouble when the electorate just doesn't know, or unfortunately, sometimes they've given up and been apathetic. This is why the media is so important, and to kind of shed light on things that are happening behind the scenes. I don't think that there's a direct correlation between one sole commissioner, county government, and others, but the risk is higher.
Very good. The Trump administration has been criticized for politicizing the Department of Justice. Is that a fair criticism in your view?
I don't personally see that. Like I said, in the U.S. Attorney's offices, which is the largest bureau in the Department of Justice, all of us have pretty independent authority, autonomy to do a lot of things. Of course, the president sets some priority goals, and the attorney general executes those goals, and he leads us in kind of what direction we want the department to go in. But I've never felt any political pressure to do one thing or another. So I don't have personal experience in that, so I can't really opine on whether or not that's true.
Very good. The federal courts have long resisted televising their proceedings. Should they?
Well, I think that the coronavirus pandemic has kind of opened the eyes of a lot of people, and made the court proceedings much more accessible, rather than having to go out to the courthouse. Um, I think there are pros and cons to that. I do believe, just as I think the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, uh, he thinks that sometimes cameras in the courtroom uh, may impact on the way judges act and the way counsel acts. And I think that we've seen some of that when Court TV came along. And I think we've seen like this real stream commentary on the justice system. I'm not quite sure if, while it educates the public on how things work and how things happen, but in the overall scheme of things, I don't know if that's a great thing or not. I think under the right circumstances, fine, but it could be potential for bad impact. I think there's a Netflix series these days called Trial by Media that's on. And it's very interesting to see some of these high profile cases and the role kind of the media has played in the dispensing and administration of justice. And so I think it's something that needs to be studied. I'm a proponent of transparency, but at the same time, we have to make sure that over transparency or that's not going to have a negative impact on the way the framers designed the court system and the way it should operate.
I'm curious if this is something that comes up or is under active discussion when you're together with other DOJ people, other members of the federal court system. Is it something that gets talked about a lot, or not?
We don't generally talk about that. I think federal court, if you talk to some judges, I think several judges are not fans of that, having broadcasts. Other judges are. I think it's really a preference. But the U.S. attorneys, things that we do in court is public. Things that we investigate because of the impact that could have on a potential innocent person's lives. So I think there are some certain things that need to be kept from the public until there's a certain time that we have sufficient evidence to bring it public. So it's a careful balance. I think opinions might differ from U.S. attorney to U.S. attorney and judge to judge.
Very good. So what are the problems or issues facing the justice system that keep you awake at night?
Well, one of the things that we all fear as prosecutors is that we unintentionally convict a person who turned out to be innocent, right? And the only sure way, because our system of justice is not perfect, the only sure way for us to do that is to have prosecutors and law enforcement agents with good judgment and looking at facts and taking a conservative view. that we're not overly aggressive in using our prosecutorial discretion to stretch, for example, the language of the statute that's given to us, or uh, railroading a defendant with the unlimited resources of the federal government. Which, by the way, that's not true. We don't have unlimited resources, but certainly the federal government has a lot more resources than a person accused of crime in most cases. So we have to be very careful and we have to be judicious in the way we exercise our prosecutorial discretion, because just by putting a name on a piece of paper and presenting some evidence, that impacts not just that person who's being accused, but their family members and their friends and their businesses. It's a heavy responsibility, and when I select prosecutors to join this office, that's one of the things I look for. It's not about winning, it's about doing justice. And so we make sure, as I spoke in the beginning, that everybody in this office has been committed to the administration of justice, to the Constitution. And I think that as long as we are the gatekeepers of the criminal justice process, the right people are keeping the gate, that we minimize the risk of the system not working the way it should.
Very good. Do we have any more questions from the audience?
There's just one more that we haven't gotten to. Attorney Pak, what do you feel about the relationship between law enforcement and the community, specifically with regard to programs? We have a question here about a Straight Talk program for young school children. How do you see law enforcement relating to the community and any programs expanding?
I'm a big fan of that. This office has sponsored a program called Real Talk that we've matched up law enforcement agents, prosecutors, to people who have offended and have turned their lives around, and to reach the folks who are considered to be at risk. And so I think it's very effective when you see different types of role models. And they, a lot of times they see people in authority like police and prosecutors in different roles, in different contexts. It helps them understand better, and the relationship gets better. When I was in the General Assembly, we looked at this issue along with causation of mass incarceration. And obviously the law is one part of it, but what's more important, I think, is the application of the law. And so it's very important that we look at systematically, not just law enforcement's responsibility, but it's society's responsibility to make sure that all our institutions are working together. One of the things that I would like to bring out is, since racism and bias in our institution is front and center, we have to take a look at what's causing that, because no one's really born with biases in their heart, right? It's the environmental factors, maybe perhaps things that they see on TV or the news. So you have to counterbalance that with personal, one-on-one examples of how that breaks the stereotype. And one of the things that I'm very proud of, I know when you introduced me, you said I was the first Asian American U.S. attorney. I'm kind of sheepish about saying that, but I'm proud of that because I think they've never seen somebody that looks like me in this role. And I hope that they look at Asian Americans a little bit differently, because I am in this role. And people who look and have different backgrounds need to offer themselves for public service to make sure that our society gets rid of all the biases and racial prejudice. One thing that I will say, that the worst part of kind of what's happening in our political discourse and civil discourse is that we've lost our ability to have a civil discussion. It used to be that we could agree to disagree, but for some reason we're going through a phase in our country where we're less tolerant of our opposing views, and we're not willing to even hear them out. And one thing that I know for a fact is to repair anything that we have going on in our country, particularly with law enforcement and our community, is that we need to sit down and kind of listen without talking over each other, try to understand. And that may be a small step, but it's a big step. towards, I think, finding the right solution, the right balance to avoid situations like we're seeing in the recent days.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of the hour, and we want to thank you, Attorney Pak, for taking the time to speak with us today. And also would like to thank Ken Foskett for doing a great job moderating and asking the questions. And thanks to everyone for joining the Atlanta Press Club for this online Newsmaker event. Please note that this event will be online later on our YouTube channel and will have captioning. Because I know it's difficult to hear, but we also want to provide that for our Newsmaker events as well. Please go to our website, atlantapressclub.org, to see our upcoming events, sponsor events, join as a member, make a donation. Thank you so much. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.